Part 4, Chapter 24, 16th December 2006, Burglary. In mathematical chaos theory, the butterfly effect describes circumstances where a small change in initial conditions, such as the fluttering of a butterfly's wings in Osaka, Japan, might cause a really big change elsewhere, like a hurricane in Florida. It seemed a fitting metaphor to use my beloved mathematical chaos theory to show that some of the actions of the crewing department some 3 years before would now result in the worst fight of my life. We were good employers and genuinely cared about the people who worked for us. Of course, between my parents and I, we often argued on how best to achieve this, but attention to security was certainly an area where we all did agree. Back in 2003, when we had integrated the crewing department to move into our main building, the unpredictable demands of filming news meant that people now worked around the clock, so we had implemented measures to protect both the staff and the equipment. We fitted panic buttons around the building, and these would alert the police to a possible burglary without the alarms wailing. These small boxes were the size of cigarette packets and carefully designed so that they could not be triggered by accident. Around this time, the latest anti-theft innovation was the smoke cloak, which once triggered by an alarm activation would quickly fill the space with opaque smoke and disorientate any would-be burglars, thus limiting what they were able to steal. A policeman had told me that they were so effective that when they had arrived at a recent break-in call-out, some burglars were actually still inside the building, entirely lost and disorientated by the smoke. We all agreed that we needed a smoke cloak, so we instructed our alarm company to install one in the equipment area, which they did, terminating it with a 13-amp plug, where we would later find out the cleaner did the vacuuming. More on this later. On a random day in early 2004, a crew coordinator idly wondered what might happen if he pressed both of the buttons on the strange device which had been installed under his desk. Sure enough, some minutes later, having activated the new panic button system, a police car arrived, and realizing that this was a false alarm, they left. What was important about this specific event was that it was the third such false alarm in 6 months, and under the terms of our agreement, the police would now impose a penalty of withholding their remote monitoring service to us for 3 full months. This was a blow, since without police monitoring, we also no longer satisfied the terms of our insurance. For this 3-monthly period, we were doubly careful with security, knowing that for this temporary time we were not insured and waited eagerly for it to pass. On the day that marked the end of the 3-month period, since we were not permitted to liaise with the police directly, Mum telephoned the alarm company and requested that they restore the police monitoring service immediately. To remind you, this was the very same alarm company who had previously fitted the panic buttons and the smoke cloak and were now responsible for restoring our police monitoring service. During that fateful phone call, the alarm company confirmed that they would restore the service, but unwisely, Mum had not decided to put this request into writing, either with a fax, letter or email, just a phone call. Then 3 years later, on the 16th of December 2006 at 2 a.m., a gang of thieves broke into the main building and carried out an audacious burglary. The smoke cloak would have really slowed them down and prevented much from being stolen, but the cleaner had not plugged the device back into the power socket when he had completed the vacuuming. Without power, it was useless. The police should have come quickly too, and the sound of their sirens would have forced the burglars to hurry up and leave early, but with no active monitoring system in place, they did not come either. So instead of a smash and grab, these thieves took their time and made off with an enormous haul of cameras, lenses and other specialist equipment, which we would later value at around £600,000. What made this even worse was that we had just taken delivery of 2 of the very latest top-of-the-range Sony HD cameras, which had been bought specifically to supply a production who ought to have been shooting a feature film that week. My frustration was that the client had changed their minds at the last minute, and instead of hiring them from us, had now hired them from a competitor. So as well as losing the production hire revenue, we also now lost a further £104,000 worth of cameras too, which were still unopened in their original cardboard cartons. Chapter 25. The Aftermath. Whilst this robbery was really annoying and inconvenient, we were confident of being fully covered by our insurance policy, so we cleaned up the mess and made a full stocktake of what was missing, after which we submitted a hefty insurance claim to our insurance company. The robbery happened less than a week before we were due to break up for our fortnightly Christmas holiday, and to our shock and dismay, we had just been informed that our police monitoring service was not active. We made a formal request to our alarm company to reinstate the service, but they were adamant that this would take 21 working days to go live. So, with no other options available, and not wanting to risk being uninsured again, we hired a security firm to supply a 24-hour security guard with dog to patrol our buildings over the entire Christmas break and until the monitoring service was resumed in January. There is always a delay of some months between making an insurance claim and receiving a payout, and being a major claim, the insurance company had assigned a claims investigator to us who started work in earnest in early January 2007. We had already completed a major cost-cutting exercise just a few months previously and now made the reasonable assumption that our business interruption insurance policy would pay for whatever additional costs we faced as a consequence of the burglary. We had lost a lot of equipment in this loss. Much of it belonged to the finance companies, but the leases still needed to be paid, and until these cameras were replaced, our reduced stock had a hugely detrimental effect on our ability to earn revenue. We hired in replacement equipment from other companies when we were short because our equipment had been stolen, and bought new cameras when we needed them for long jobs. All suppliers were told that they would have to wait for payment until the insurance payout was made. Seeing that we were very concerned about the uncertainty of the claim, the insurance investigator had told us not to worry, since if we could prove that we'd been paying for the police monitoring service, then of course we would be covered. We obligingly provided invoices which we had paid over the past 3 years to confirm this. But on doing so, the insurance company did not immediately offer us the reassurance that we had been expecting. Instead, the investigation continued into February, March, and April, and as time passed, we began to become more and more concerned as our bills mounted alarmingly. We were still puzzled as to why the police claimed that we didn't have the monitoring service in place at the time of the burglary, since Mum definitely had phoned them to request this. Over time, though, we realised that the alarm company must have not actioned her verbal request in that fateful call 3 years before. On contacting the alarm company, they informed us that they had a record of the phone call which had taken place on the day in question with my mum, but no detailed notes existed about exactly what was discussed. It didn't matter that this call had occurred exactly 3 months from the date that the monitoring service had been withdrawn. It was obvious what the subject would have been about and what we would have asked them to do, but they would not be drawn into this. I cannot stress how hard these months were, and everybody became very dejected as we began to face the possibility that the insurance company might wriggle out of paying us at all, in which case our debts would almost certainly wipe us out. As a rule, I don't give up, but the future seemed so uncertain now, I started exploring the unthinkable and even applied for some jobs. These came to nothing, but reminds me that I was really now at rock bottom. Chapter 26. Be careful what you aim for. When I was studying my MBA, I remember being told of a study where a group of Harvard undergraduates were interviewed before they graduated and asked about their 5-year plan. A follow-up study looked at what they were doing 5 years later, and most importantly, remember that this was a US study, how much they earned. What was fascinating was that there was a 100% correlation between those who had had a plan earning more money than their peers. What their plan was and whether they had achieved it was not a factor here, only that they had had a plan. Watch your thoughts, for they become words. Watch your words, for they become actions. Watch your actions, for they become habits. Watch your habits, because they become your character. and watch your character, for it becomes your destiny. What we think we become. My father always said that, and I think I am fine. This was said by Margaret Thatcher as portrayed in the film The Iron Lady, and I love this quote and have said it so many times to my son that he can recite it without thinking. To me, this is a really poignant quote because I have planned for my entire life, and at this stage I don't mind admitting it had not gone very well. In life, it is crucial to aim for achieving the balance of planning for the future, but also enjoying the here and now, though this of course isn't ideal. At times you don't have this luxury and simply have to do what needs to be done in order to survive. The burglary and its aftermath didn't stop me from planning, nor aiming to improve my life balance, but that would have to wait for now. I value loyalty, hard work, honesty, integrity, intelligence, as well as kindness, but above all, I feel that the character trait that I value most in myself is determination. In my 20s, I wanted to be a wealthy man, and then this became a dutiful son, and today, a better person. These days, however, I now measure my income by my laughter lines, not my bank account. My wife tells me that on this measure, I am wealthy indeed. Chapter 27. The Uninsured Loss. Late in the afternoon of Monday the 4th of June, Mum asks me into Dad's office, which in itself was rare. They were both standing, motionless with grim, steely expressions on their faces, trying hard not to betray the boiling turmoil that they were feeling inside. "They aren't going to honour the claim," she said calmly. That was it. Just 7 words, and our hope of a happy outcome crumpled. I just spoke to them on the phone, and they told me straight. The directors had a personal responsibility to ensure that we had police monitoring services in place. And as we clearly didn't, they're not going to honour the claim, citing breach of terms. They're going to hide behind this technicality and wriggle out of paying, she said. "That's it? No appeal?" I asked vainly. "That's it." "Can we sue the alarm company?" I asked. "No chance. Their terms and conditions are pretty airtight to protect them from third-party liability." "So what's the actual financial position as of today?" I ask. "Well, we owe our suppliers £339,000, VAT of £79,000, 29k PAYE, and we also owe the factoring company £120,000, said Mum. "So we actually owe almost £600,000. Wow, I said glumly. "How much is in the bank?" "Actually, we have literally no money." "Can it be any worse?" I asked. "Since the financial restructure of last year, we've not been able to keep up with the lease repayments either, and have £15,000 in arrears, so we're now in danger of having our cameras repossessed." "It gets worse," I said. "And the insurance company definitely said that they wouldn't honour the claim? We were relying on that £600,000. "No. They told me definitively today that this was their final decision." Bastards! They could have told us this 6 months ago so that we could have cut our costs further instead of waiting for a payout that they had no intention of honouring, and now it's just too late. We owe almost 600k, which works out about 5 months of revenue. We have little equipment that wasn't stolen, which we can actually rent out and actually earn us any revenue. We owe £15,000 in overdue leases, and you're telling me that we have no money?" I said. "And don't forget the £250,000 of personal guarantees that we have to the leasing companies if we go bust," added in Dad. The 3 members of the VMI board looked at each other grimly. Business failure looked certain. "Right then, I'm going to have to think of a plan," I said. This was met by silence. "I'm off for a bike ride. Geneva to Cannes through the Alps should do it. 1,000 kilometres and 21 Alps. See you in 2 weeks, and I will have a plan." Chapter 28. An Awful Choice. A famous thought experiment of mathematical game theory creates a scenario where a train is hurtling out of control and in about 20 seconds will smash into a station where it will kill hundreds of people. You alone are next to the controls, where you can avoid this from happening by remotely changing the track points to divert the train. But to your horror, you can see a child who is playing on the alternative track and who will be killed if you take this action. It is just a thought experiment, but researchers have found that no one wants to make an active choice which will directly cause the avoidable death of a single individual, even if this action can avoid several other deaths. I find that if you don't like something and find yourself in a difficult situation, then you have 3 choices. 1. Do nothing. 2. Do something about it. 3. Sit in it and wait. Oh no, this is actually the same as 1. I could now see that the money that we owed was approaching the value of the entire company's assets, including the valuable freehold, so we were close to being insolvent and trading illegally. Kevin had a film background and had been brought in to help the company improve its rental standards, but had not been given either a free hand nor the money to achieve this. A partnership with Kevin and I running the firm now seemed to offer the company the best chances of recovery and restoring it to profitability, but there was an enormous barrier to overcome first before we could do this. Dad had to agree to leave his company, and if he didn't, then I would need to force him out or face the consequences. The choices available to me now were bleak. 1. I could keep things as they were, and clearly, without changing the very basics of the business, we would go bust. I would lose everything, but would keep the relationship with my parents. I didn't like this one. 2. My parents could leave the company, either voluntarily or not, and then Kevin and I could completely reinvent it and turn it into a great success. This was a huge challenge given the depth of the financial mess which we were now in, and was unlikely to succeed anyway, besides which, my relationship with my parents, and in particular with my dad, would suffer too. However, if we did succeed, then it would protect my parents from suffering financial hardship, and they would keep the value of their shares. I didn't really like this one either. 3. The nuclear option. I did actually have a third choice, and several of my friends urged me to consider it. By voluntarily liquidating the company and buying back all of the assets at a great discount, then all of our suppliers' debts would be wiped clean, and with lower financial commitments, we would have the best chances of success. However, Kevin and I would now own 100% of the new shares outright, and my parents would end up with nothing. This would be my best personal outcome for sure, but would also destroy my relationship with my parents without any hope of a reconciliation. But could I do this to my parents? I was about to go for the longest cycle ride in my life, and which would give me 2 full weeks to think. It weighed heavily on my mind, but however much I thought about it, I knew that I could not bring myself to burn my parents. Chapter 29. Cycling. I used to ride a bike when I was at school, but after I bought my first car, then just like my friends, I never looked back. After we moved to Kent, though, I was to discover that exercise was really difficult to fit into a commuting lifestyle, since I would leave home early in the morning, and by the evening I was simply too tired, and the prospect of taking a car journey just to keep fit became too much effort for me. I tried many sports over the years, some of which I still keep up, but in late 2006 I tried a new strategy and decided to take up cycling again. I realised that since the closest railway station to my home was 10 miles away, up and down the rolling hills of Kent, so riding to the station would itself be a workout, and returning home again would be another workout too. I was going to make the trip to the station in any case, so it shouldn't even eat much into my day either, I thought, though when I first tried this journey, I don't mind confessing that it half killed me. However, I persevered, riding an old steel-framed trail bike, initially cycling 2 days a week, then occasionally 3 days a week with a rest day in between. It was about this time that I was approached to sponsor a charity media bike ride through the Alps called the Fireflies, which was a group that had started in 2000 to raise money for leukemia research and continues to ride today. www.thefirefliestour.com. I lent them a video camera so that they could shoot a film of the 2006 ride, and which would help them to raise awareness for their cause, and I was invited to the film screening later that year. I remember watching a piece to camera by a Firefly cyclist who gave his account of the long, arduous climb up the Col de la Madeleine. This is an exhausting 25k climb to the summit, which is called a col, and midway he explained how he had rung his friend to tell him how much he was suffering. But instead of sympathizing, his friend reminded him that when he eventually got off his bike, his pain would stop. But for those with leukemia, their pain would endure. He commanded him to endure the pain. This really inspired me, and I spontaneously decided that I too would become a Fireflies rider and raise £10,000 for their cause by riding the Alps in June of 2007. It didn't matter that my life and business were inherently uncertain. Training for the Alpine Fireflies ride provided a welcome distraction for me, so I bought a road bike and began training. About this time, the rules governing travelling on trains with full-sized bicycles had changed, and now, during peak time journeys, you could only carry fold-up bikes. I had secured special permission from the Charing Cross station manager to allow me to travel on these busy trains during the spring and summer of 2007 with a full-sized road bike. So I trained, and in time, my 3 days riding to the station became 4 days and then 5 days per week. I did a lot of training rides at the weekends too, concentrating on riding hills and becoming used to being in the saddle for 5 hours or more at a time. All veteran Fireflies had told me that there weren't any hills in the UK that could properly prepare you for cycling over 21 alpine mountains, since these mountains were big and cycling 1,000 kilometres for 8 days with just one rest day was hard, and they were right. However, by the time the summer was approaching, my wife recalls that my thighs looked like muscular chicken legs, which were totally out of proportion with the rest of my body. I continued riding to the station, and by September of that year, I realised that I had not filled my car with fuel since April, and made the brave, and some say stupid, decision to sell it. I knew that this would commit me to riding to the station from that point on, even in sideways hailstones and torrential rain. The Scandinavians have an aphorism that there is no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing, and I can attest to this with my now extensive cycle wardrobe. I sold my car in late 2007, and we've been a single-car family ever since. When I work in London, I continue to ride my bike to the station, even in snow and driving rain. The Firefly send-off was on the 8th of June when I met the other riders for the first time. Filled with trepidation, I travelled to Lake Geneva on the 10th of June, and from my hotel room I could see the majestic peaks across the expanse of water that I would soon be cycling over. The following morning of the 11th of June 2007, 50 riders started the 8-day ride to cross the 1,000 kilometres and 21 Alps by bicycle. During the weeks before, I managed to raise £6,500, mainly by asking individuals to donate. This seemed to be even more effort than the training and the riding. The ride, however, was exhilarating and gave me many hours to consider my predicament, and the break provided a welcome opportunity for me to really think about the life journey that I had taken and where my future might lay. I thought about how I had originally only joined the company in order to assist my parents because Mum had implored me to, and remembered that she had even been prepared for me to forego my degree to do this. Then I had put all of my life plans on hold whilst I tried to help them and had never received any thanks for it. In my early to mid-20s, when I had few responsibilities and could have easily left to start my career, we all pulled in different directions, but I continued to put my needs after those of my parents and loyally remained with the company. Then again, in my late 20s, when I made the decision to forge a career for myself in the city, once again Mum engineered the situation which enforced me to stay against my wishes. Later, when I achieved my aim of finding a buyer for the company, then again Mum was responsible for preventing me from leaving. My excellent plan to move to Kent had also backfired, as Mum and Dad had sabotaged this from working properly, resulting in my general manager quitting and allowing the mismanagement of the company in my absence. When Josh came of school age, we later found that our local school was oversubscribed and had been obliged to send him to a private prep school. To begin with, we didn't mind since I was initially well paid, but as the school fees ramped up, which coincided with me taking several substantial pay cuts, we really suffered financially. unlike me, Josh developed to be really creative and eventually went on to study graphic design at university rather than taking the academic route. This meant that the grammar school system that we had planned for him no longer suited, so we were now obliged to remain with the private school system after all and faced 8 more years of school fees. My parents knew that we had reduced our mortgage payments to interest only and were actually partly drawing down on our mortgage for some years just to top up our salary so we could live. They were aware too that we had personal guarantees on our house, but this didn't seem to concern them. Finally, by not putting the request to reinstate the police monitoring service in writing, Mum had directly caused the latest crisis. I was now 39, with little chance of a second career, and the truth was that with the mortgage, family and private school fees, I was now trapped and needed this job. But I remembered the lesson that I'd learned on the first day of my MBA when the paper tower couldn't be built because of multiple major generals. The 3 Bassets were all major generals pulling in different directions. Our metaphoric tower would never be built if we remained together. I recognised how important Kevin was for the company's recovery, but only I seemed to be the one who fully realised his value. After many years of trying to support my parents in a secondary role, my conclusion was that if VMI were to be saved, then I would need to take full control, and in doing so, this would safeguard everyone's financial future. The company needed me in order to survive, so I would need to make the next move. 2 weeks later, I returned to London with reality waiting for me. Chapter 30. Crunch Time. The morning of Monday the 25th of June arrived, and I entered the kitchen, dressed as usual in my cycle gear, since of course I now cycle to the station every day. This morning I was to attend a crucial board meeting to decide on the future of the company, and this would be attended by our accountant, and I could not be late. I usually allowed 35 minutes to cycle the hilly 14 kilometres, 10 miles, ride to the station, and had only broken 30 minutes once before and had an irritating habit of cutting this fine. However, just before leaving, I glanced at my watch and realised in horror that the microwave clock was running 5 minutes fast. I did a mental calculation that the train would actually depart in 29 minutes, so I grabbed my bike and rode like I had never ridden before, and 27 minutes 55 seconds later, I boarded the train to London. I've never equalled this time since that day. 90 minutes later, I arrived at the office, changed, and entered the meeting room. During my journey, I'd run through all of the options over and over again in my head, and now I knew exactly what I had to do. Both of my parents were waiting for me, and the short wait before the accountant arrived was tense. All 3 of us were pensive, and whilst the experience of riding a bike through the Alps had given me a lot that I could have talked about, I found that even I couldn't speak much. Eventually, both Kevin and Nick entered the room. Nick had been our accountant for several years and had now become both a friend, advisor, and when required, a mediator to stop the Bassets from fighting. I had also invited Kevin to attend, since he was central to my plan and we had spoken at length over the weekend. I opened the meeting and gave a précis of the situation. Our creditors have been eagerly awaiting for our insurance payout, and now that it is not coming, they won't wait any longer. I continued, with what we owe the main equipment dealer and other creditors, including VAT, other taxes, factoring and lease arrears, it is absolutely clear now that we cannot survive. Without immediate and decisive action, we are facing certain bankruptcy. This was not new information, but as I uttered these words, they seemed to take on a new meaning, like having a judge committing me to a life jail sentence. I looked at my parents now. Whilst you and Mum have assets, I only have my home and a large mortgage. The personal guarantees are certain to be activated should we go pop, and this will mean that I will lose everything, and I'm not prepared for this to happen without a fight. There was silence as I delivered this, and nobody said anything. I began to perspire and could feel my heart thumping beneath my shirt. We owe £578,000, and any one of the companies that we owe money to can at any time issue us with a wind-up petition, which will close us down, and then that will be it. Doors closed. We simply have to show them that we are a new board with new ideas, so they will have the confidence to support us. There was still a deathly silence from everyone in the room except the sound of my voice, and I felt a deep sense of unease at what I was about to say. I was sure that the sound of my racing heart was audible to the others in the room. It sounded really loud to me. "We have only two options," I said. I had already decided that I wasn't going to burn my parents, and didn't even think that it would help the situation to mention the nuclear option, even just in passing. "Either we go bust and lose everything, and this for me is not an option, or—" I was still their dutiful son, but I was also a survivor, and I knew what was coming. "I consider that the best chance for our survival is for Kevin and I to work together in partnership, where I run sales, marketing and finance, leaving Kevin, with his excellent technical skills, to run the camera floor," I said. "We plan to reposition VMI from where it is as an also-ran hire company to one known for its excellent service. This will be really hard to achieve, but it is the best chance that we have to save the company from certain ruin," I said. My parents did not move their attention from looking at me. Mum already knew what I was going to say and had agreed to go along with the plan, but I hadn't spoken to Dad since returning from France, as I knew that this would not go down well with him. His face still maintained a grim, funereal expression, and though I looked carefully, his face betrayed little else. I continued to look at my parents, pausing momentarily for impact. "So, Kevin and I should become sole directors, and the two of you should voluntarily agree to leave the board," I said. I then waited a while for this to fully sink in, and looked at my dad now with imploring eyes. "If you and Mum don't resign, then our creditors simply won't trust us to change course, and they will close us down, and we will all lose everything." I did not waver in my intensity. "But the upside from your position is that you'll both keep the majority of your shareholding, and over time you'll also lose your personal guarantees as well," I said. I thought this was a generous offer. After all, I was taking all of the risk, and Kevin and I would be doing all of the work. They would still retain their shareholding too. Dad's face remained tight. I could guess what he was thinking, and I would much rather be somewhere else right now, and the worst was still to come. I glanced at Mum, and it was clear that she was ready to say out loud what I wanted to hear. "I agree to resign as director," she said. I nodded appreciatively. I looked at Dad. His face had darkened, but he still said nothing. I could see that he was furious, but was working hard to keep a lid on it. The silence was deafening, and as we all looked at each other, our eyes flicked from one person to another as we tried to make some sense from the unfolding situation. It was very clear that we were all waiting for Dad to respond to this, and eventually he said angrily, "You can't do this! I have rights, you know!" His head was now shaking slightly. I'd been here many times before. This meant that he was boiling inside and about to explode. I could see that he was clearly very angry. But at least he wasn't shouting yet, I thought. That would come later. I kept my voice impassive, as I wasn't going to fuel a shouting match. "Dad, you don't have automatic rights to remain as a director," I said calmly. "Mum and I control 65% of the shares, so if you don't resign, then I will have no option but to force you out. This is the law." He continued to stare at me, and his face was now shaking visibly. "Please don't make me do this," I said quietly. "You have to do what you have to do," he said, and then left the room. We all looked at each other in amazement. It wasn't supposed to have gone like this. I went into Dad's office and spent the next 90 minutes trying to explain my reasoning to him and the ramifications of doing nothing. But he was unyielding and uncompromising. He would not go. His volume rose and rose, until eventually his shouting could be heard throughout the entire building. He yelled that if forced out, he would set fire to the entire building. He would rather do this than give it to me. He kept yelling to me that I was not his equal. All I wanted to do was save the company and my own skin, but he was having none of it. It was really sad to hear him say these words, and it was clear that he felt betrayed by me, and I began to have some doubts that I was doing the right thing, but I stayed strong and held my nerve. Nick then spent the next 2 hours also trying to reason with him, but Dad felt that the time for being reasonable had passed. This was a direct attack on him, and if war is declared, then in his book, you never surrender. We reconvened in the meeting room once he'd calmed down a bit, but his face still had the same bitter, grim expression of before. I knew that he would never forgive me for what I was about to do, but just like his position 12 years before, I felt that I had no other option. The rest of the meeting was a formality. I put forward a motion to make Kevin a director, since companies need to have at least 2 directors by law, and Mum and I voted this through. Then, with my heart in my mouth, I put forward a motion to vote Dad out from the company that he had set up, that he loved, and that gave him an identity. There was again silence as Mum and I formally voted him out. He looked at me with cold, hateful eyes. It was done. This was the hardest decision that I had ever taken, and now would become the hardest period in my life too. I needed to deliver and save VMI, otherwise it would all have been for nothing.